So welcome back to our continued study of Swinburne's The Coherence of Theism. Today we're going to be discussing omnipotence. I want to begin with some general remarks about omnipotence. So omnipotence comes from the Latin word omnipotens, which translates the Greek word pantokrator, which is translated as having all powers. Swinburne translated as has the power over everything or can do anything. Now, I think it's very important to keep the religious context in mind here when we're discussing omnipotence. We need to remember that there is a big question about the relationship between a philosophical discussion or exploration of a perfect being and the kind of all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being that you see in religious context. So I have up here a few passages from the Hebrew Scriptures and then also from the New Testament. So for example, in the book of Job, Job says, "I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." So here we have this idea that the divine being that Job is in discussion with has the ability to do all things, that there's nothing that this being can't do, and that whatever purpose this being has will be accomplished. The sense here is that there's no natural obstacles to this being. It's not as if the fact that there's a storm coming somehow or another prevents this divine being from acting in ways that they want this being to do. Similarly, in the book of Jeremiah, we have this passage where the prophet Jeremiah says, "It is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." And we see also passages in the New Testament that express a very similar thought. In Matthew, we have this record that Jesus is recorded to say that with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And here again, this idea that the kinds of limitations that creatures like us face aren't limitations to the divine being. The real philosophical question here is whether a general notion of omnipotence may not be adequate for expressing the kinds of claims that religious believers in monotheistic traditions have wanted to express. A good place to begin our discussion of omnipotence is over the paradox of the stone. So the paradox of the stone centers on the question of whether God can make a stone too heavy for himself to lift. I have a link to a modern version of this from The Simpsons about whether Jesus can microwave a burrito so hot that he himself cannot eat it. And I'll put that link in the descriptions. So here is how we can formulate the paradox of the stone as an argument that there cannot be an omnipotent person. So the first claim is that either God can make a stone too heavy for himself to lift, or God cannot make a stone too heavy for himself to lift. So this claim is true. It's an instance of the law of excluded middle. It says either P is true or not P is true. Claim 2, if God can make a stone too heavy for himself to lift, then there's something that God can't do, namely lift the stone that has been created. Premise 3 says that if God cannot make a stone too heavy for himself to lift, then there's something that God can't do, namely make this stone that's too heavy for him to lift. And so it follows from those three claims that there's something that God can't do. Now we add the additional premise that connects premise 4 with the idea that God's not omnipotent, which says that if there is something that God can't do, then God is not omnipotent. And so you get the conclusion that God's not omnipotent. Now this argument is logically valid. It follows by inference rules that most everyone is familiar with, and it's an interesting argument because it raises some key questions about how we should understand omnipotence. So let's turn to those now. So the crucial thing to notice about the principle is that the bridge principle, premise 5, is false. Oftentimes when you face a surprising argument, it's really important to figure out what are the bridged principles, because bridged principles are unstated assumptions that link various claims and arguments. And it takes some philosophical skill to figure out how you're going to formulate an appropriate bridge principle. But the way we have the paradox of the stone formulated, it says that the relevant bridge principle, principle 5, if there's something that God can't do, then God's not omnipotent. But when we think about this just isn't true. God can't make a square circle. A square circle is a logical impossibility. It's not as if somewhere out there there's a square circle and we're saying that this is something that is outside of God's control. It's just something that can't exist. Square circles can't exist. Also, there are things that can exist, but an omnipotent being can't bring about. So consider an uncaused event. An uncaused event is a logical possibility, but God can't bring about an uncaused event. To bring that about, it would have to be caused. God can't change the past, and we will talk more about this later. So when we think about the paradox of the stone, the key problem in the stone paradox is that God cannot create a rock that God cannot lift. But if we think about this, we can think, for example, there are two individuals. One individual has the power to create rocks as large as this person wants them to be. He has unlimited rock creating power. Another individual has the unlimited rock lifting power. It's a logical consequence that the person with the unlimited rock creating power can't create a rock so heavy that the person with unlimited rock lifting power can't lift that rock. So this helpfully focuses on the idea that the thought that God possesses all powers, there are going to be consequences of that thought. That doesn't have anything to do with not having relevant powers. It's just a consequence of having unlimited power, that this being cannot create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it. Okay, so we want to move towards a more adequate account of omniscience. And we're going to start off by talking about what are known as McEar objections. So consider this account of omniscience. This is account alpha, the first stab that Swinburne gives. So he says S is omnipotent at a time t if and only if S is able at t to cause any event M that is logically possible that S could cause at t. Now, one thing to note about this is if you look closely, it says that S, a subject, is able at t to cause any event M that's logically possible that S could cause. So there is an identification there of subjects between being able to cause any event that that very same being could cause. Now, there is a reason for that restriction, because accounts of omnipotence often are designed to fill out a conception of a perfect being, where omnipotence is one part of being perfect, goodness is another part. And so what you want is that people who are offering accounts of omnipotence are thinking, okay, well, if there's a being that's perfectly good, this being's going to have some restrictions. This being's not going to be able to sin, for example. And so you want to formulate an account of omnipotence that's going to be consistent with the idea that there's going to be certain things about an omnipotent being's nature that means that they can't do, and you want your account of omnipotence to be compatible with that. The problem with that account is that it runs up against what's known as the McEar objection. This is an objection that was first formulated by Alvin Plantinga in his seminal book, God and Other Minds. So McEar is a being who essentially can do no action except scratching his left ear. And notice that McEar would be omnipotent given alpha. So McEar can do nothing other than scratch his left ear, so McEar is able at t to cause any event M that is logically possible that McEar could cause at t, so it would follow that McEar is omnipotent. Clearly, this is not a good account of omnipotence. And so Swinburne moves to a better account of omnipotence, that S is omnipotent at a time t if and only if S is able at t to cause any event M, which is logically possible that some being cause at t. But notice that while this escapes the McEar problem, it still has the problem with figuring out how omnipotence is compatible with perfect goodness. So what Swinburne does next is gives us a tour of certain questions about events and time and causation. I'll refer you back to the book here to read this discussion. So I just want to summarize some of the points for the main discussion. So Swinburne is going to argue that events are not instantaneous. They don't occur at an instantaneous point of time, but that every event occurs over a period of time, and you can take smaller and smaller periods of time if that matters. He's also going to argue that simultaneous and backward causation are impossible. And the reason that this is important is related to understanding restrictions for omnipotence. So just as it's not a limitation on God's power that God cannot create a square circle, It's not a limitation of God's power that God cannot change the past. So the idea here is that, in addition to the logical facts, there are temporal facts that constrain in some sense or another God's power, but it's not a real constraint. It's just we need to understand ways reality can be, and reality can't be certain ways, and so we shouldn't expect that an omnipotent being would be able to change relevant, modal facts. The next item that Swinburne discusses does come up a lot in discussions of philosophy of religion, so it's important to know the difference between a hard fact and a soft fact, or a hard event and a soft event. So consider the state of affairs that John met Mary in 1988, and then they got married in 1990. So then it's true that John met his future wife in 1988. And so the question is, does God have control over the fact that John met his future wife in 1988? And there's one way of looking at that where you think, no, God doesn't have control over that fact, because what makes it true is a combination of events. What makes it true is that John met Mary in 1988, and then they got married in 1990. So God can't make it false in 1988 that John met his future wife in 1988, because it entails an event in the future. And so philosophers make a distinction between a hard event and a soft event. An event E is a hard event at T if and only if the occurrence or non-occurrence of times before or after T is neither logically necessary nor logically sufficient for the occurrence of E. Given the occurrence of other events that occurred at T, for the occurrence of which the occurrence or non-occurrence of times before or after T is neither logically necessary nor logically sufficient. So John met his future wife in 1988 is not a hard event in 1988 because it entails a future event. So where this is going is the idea that we should understand omnipotence just in terms of hard events. Soft events are not the kinds of things that we should expect an omnipotent being to have control over. An example of a hard event is my toothache at midday. This event is such that the occurrence or non-occurrence of times before or after my toothache at midday is neither logically necessary nor logically sufficient for the occurrence of E. So Swinburne moves on to another characterization of omnipotence. So we get account gamma, the third account of omnipotence. So this says that S is omnipotent throughout some period of time t, if and only if S is able to cause, by an act beginning at any instance t, during that period any logically contingent hard event m, beginning at any instant t sub 1 later than t. So we see here the requirement that an omnipotent person only needs to be able to cause hard events. So we understand that restriction. Now, a problem with account gamma is that S may set in motion a series of events that are then outside of S's control. If we think of a Rube Goldberg machine here, that in some sense you kick the initial domino, and then a series of actions happen with logical necessity or physical necessity that you have no control over, there's a sense in which you're not omnipotent about the later events occurring because they're occurring outside of your control. Swinburne is also here concerned with God's own free action, which is interesting. So we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get to the next chapter on omniscience and its relationship with human freedom. The concern that Swinburne has is that if God were to know what God is going to do in the future, then he's thinking that in some sense or another God is not omnipotent in the future because he's constrained by his actions in the future. So Swinburne moves to account delta, fourth stab, and he says that S is omnipotent throughout some period of time t, if and only if S is able to cause, by an act beginning at an instance t and ending at an instant t sub 2, both during that period, any logically contingent event m, which is a hard event, beginning at any instant t sub 1, later than t and ending at t sub 2. So here the idea is that omnipotence is restricted to a time period where you're able to bring about any logically contingent event within that time period. You can't set in motion a series of events that are then going to be outside of your control. So Swinburne moves on to his final account of omniscience, epsilon. And what I want to do is I want to run through this account and then notice how it differs from the earlier account. The main difference is going to be the knowledge condition and the goodness condition. So this is account epsilon. Account epsilon is given on page 172. So Swinburne writes that S is omnipotent during some period of time t if and only if these three conditions hold: the knowledge condition, the goodness conditions, and the power condition. Knowledge condition says that in each sub-period within t, S knows of all logically necessary propositions and of all logically contingent true propositions about every time earlier than the beginning of that sub-period, and of all the propositions that those propositions entail that they are true. Now in the next slide we're going to look at the argument for the knowledge condition, but just note this is the first instance we have of a knowledge requirement on omnipotence, and we'll try to figure out what that basic idea is later. And the basic idea, which we'll investigate a little bit later, is that to truly be omnipotent you have to have a lot of knowledge. So the second condition is what I'm calling the goodness condition, and here the idea is that S is not influenced by non-rational influences. We're going to get an argument for this later, but Swinburne's basic idea is that being subject to non-rational influences is a weakness, it's not a power. So if an individual, for example, doesn't get enough sleep, then their power is diminished. I think that's very intuitive. They're tired, they're subject to make poor decisions, and so on. They're under non-rational influences. So if we're thinking of an omnipotent being, we're thinking of a being that isn't influenced by non-rational influences, that all its decisions are in some sense or another within its perfect power. And then we have the power condition, which we've seen this before in earlier accounts. So S is able to cause by an act beginning at any instance t and in any instance t sub 2, both during that period, any logically contingent event M, hard event, beginning at an instance t sub 1, later than t and ending at t sub 2, so within that time period, which does not require M to be influenced by non-rational influences in order to do that act. So this is very similar to account delta, just with the addition that this being isn't influenced by non-rational influences. Swinburne thinks that epsilon is an adequate account of omnipotence. So I want to look at the argument for the knowledge condition. Why I think there's a knowledge condition on omnipotence. The basic idea is that knowledge is a power, and so a being with all powers needs all knowledge. So here's an argument that omnipotence requires omniscience. Premise 1 is that an omnipotent being can help anyone in need. So for any person, any circumstance, an omnipotent being will be able to help that person in need. But S can help another person in need only if S knows what the need is, and S knows what the best way is to fulfill that need. Both best in sense of prudentially the best, but also morally the best. And so S is going to have a lot of particular knowledge. S is going to need to know of any true event that it occurs in order to be able to help anyone in need. And that S needs to have moral knowledge and prudential knowledge. And the thought is that in premise 2, both A and B require considerable factual and moral knowledge. So I think that's true. I think that premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, premise 3 is true. The key claim here is what's the difference between considerable factual and moral knowledge and omniscience. And so premise 4 in a way is a bridge principle, trying to connect premise 3 with what we want in the conclusion that this requires omniscience. And so premise 4 says that a being without omniscience will be unable to help someone in need at some time and thus not be omnipotent. Now why I think that is true? Arguably, the idea is that there will be cases in which individuals will be in need and no one else will know of the need. And so if there legitimately is an omnipotent being who legitimately can help anyone in need, that being will need to know about states that no one else knows. And so you might think, well, isn't there still a gap? Isn't it possible that an omnipotent being might not need to know every fact there is? And you might think, well, what about some very trivial facts? Like, does this omnipotent being need to know whether the number of stars in the galaxy is prime or not? And admittedly, the argument from being able to help anyone in need doesn't give you a direct argument that yes, this omnipotent being would need to know whether the number of stars in the galaxy is prime or not. You can think of some convoluted examples where someone is in a situation where they have to be able to give the correct answer to whether the number of stars in the universe is prime or not, and so they're going to need some help, and I'm going to be help. But I think at this point it's just more accurate to say, okay, yeah, there is this gap in the argument. It's still, there can be gaps in lots of arguments that are still plausible arguments, and so my sense is that this is a plausible argument that omnipotence requires omniscience or something very close to omniscience. So then we have this question, is omnipotence logically possible? Swinburne mentions this strategy, which we'll see over and over. He says that in general, if it's logically possible that a substance can have some limited degree of a property, it's logically possible that a substance can have some unlimited degree of that property. And then he suggests that there's no point at which an expansion of powers becomes logically impossible. And so this makes it plausible that it is possible that there is an omnipotent being, that at least omnipotence is logically possible. Okay, so there is a move that Swinburne makes at the very end of this chapter which is important, and I want to flag it for you. So this is the relationship between omnipotence and other divine properties. And what we're going to see in the second trilogy on the existence of God, this is a move that Swinburne's going to make that's going to be very crucial for his overall project. So Swinburne thinks that all the divine properties analyzed in the two previous chapters follow from omnipotence in sense epsilon. So perfect freedom follows, omnipresence follows, and omniscience follows. The importance is that the divine properties are not independent from one another. So it's not as if God is a Lego character that you have to put hair on and a head and arms and legs and a backpack and a compass and a map and so on. Rather, the thought is that the hypothesis that there is a substance with these properties is a very simple hypothesis. It's the hypothesis, what we'll see later, is that there's a substance with one property, the property of being a being of pure, limitless, intentional power. So if we're thinking about a measure of the plausibility of theism, it's going to turn out that theism is a relatively plausible hypothesis because it only requires a substance with a few, perhaps one, property. So this is an important passage to flag, to think about later on in terms of the overall project.